Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Policy and Energy Notes with Neil. Much to cover in today's segment, starting with conflict in Iran and the energy implications. This is pretty significant. As we're recording, we're almost 10 days in, and we're seeing dramatic disruptions in the flow of oil and natural gas and petrochemicals and fertilizer, which is really the issue, is getting through the Strait of Hormuz. And this has significant energy implications. We're talking about maybe a quarter of the world's oil supply that flows through the strait. This is going to have both domestic and global economic impacts, and we're starting to see the results of that. But it's a mixed bag. It's complicated. I think in the short term, China, which is dependent on imports of oil and natural gas, could see some pain in the short term. But longer term, if this precipitates a move towards greater deployment of clean energy resources around the world, this could flip to China's favor as the world's leading electro state. Look, we saw this happen before in the 1970s. The growth in the US of solar and wind was really driven by oil shocks and people's concerns and wanting to move away from oil products. The duration of this conflict, I think, will implicate how those sorts of strategic energy decisions go forward. But again, as somebody who's focused on the deployment of clean energy resources in the U.S., as well as further building out the supply chain domestically, I think, I'm choosing to see potential opportunities here. Also, broader implications for Russia. Russia, which, let's not forget, there's still conflict in Ukraine, and Europeans have been swearing off imports of Russian gas. Could this potentially force the Europeans to turn back to Russia as they look to replace some of the LNG supply that they were banking on getting from Qatar, which is obviously having issues coming through the strait. And this was all on top of, U.S. engagement in Venezuela. It's really interesting. President Trump campaigned on not having the U.S. engage in these kinds of foreign entanglements and quote unquote forever wars. How the administration handles this will be immensely consequential and will be something we'll be watching very closely. On the domestic front, energy policy wise, I think the biggest recent development has been the reemergence of bipartisan negotiations regarding federal legislative permitting reform. As you recall, there had been some momentum building towards getting the necessary permitting reform policy through Congress, but some of the leading Democrat negotiators backed away after the administration unilaterally canceled some offshore wind projects. These Democratic senators have come back to the table. That gives some hope that we can get a breakthrough on permitting reform. However, we are in an election year, and these things can get complicated. I've spoken with Democrat members of Congress who have been honest and said that they don't really have much incentive to work with Republicans in the White House to bail them out on energy and affordability right now. And cooperating on permitting reform could be that lifeline to Republicans. And I'm not certain we'll get Democrat cooperation. They believe that they're going to have a successful midterm and will be in a better position to negotiate next Congress. I will note this is the same logic that Republicans had at the end of the last Congress when Senators Manchin and Barrasso were trying to move their version of bipartisan permitting reform. At that time, it was Republicans who said, hey, we're about to win the elections, potentially have a GOP trifecta. Why would we cut this permitting deal now? Let's wait until we're in power. Well, here we are a year and a half later, and we've seen no movement on permitting reform. It's going to require bipartisan cooperation. I'm hopeful it can get done this year, but it's going to be subject to a lot of greater machinations in the Senate. There's a big, wonky, weedy process debate taking place in the Senate right now regarding a legislative effort called the SAVE Act. This is a voter ID election reform bill. And it doesn't have 60 votes in the U.S. Senate, but there are some conservatives pushing to kind of weaken the legislative filibuster, the 60-vote threshold in the Senate, move to a talking filibuster that might ultimately allow for passage of the SAVE Act with a simple majority and not the supermajority at 60 votes. I personally, as a Senate institutionalist, think this is a very bad idea. And once you start to weaken the filibuster, you can't undo it. But we're seeing some traction there. A long-term Senator John Cornyn, who served in party leadership, who's in a very divisive and contested primary in Texas against Ken Paxton, the Attorney General, recently came out in favor of moving on the SAVE Act and endorsing the talking filibuster. So a lot of pressure there. Senate Republican leader John Thune has expressed that he doesn't have the votes to move to a talking filibuster, but we will be watching that closely. There's also movement in the Senate. Senator Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma was recently tapped to replace Kristi Noem as the Secretary of Homeland Security. And when he is ultimately confirmed, and most everyone believes he will have the votes to be confirmed, the governor of Oklahoma will appoint a replacement senator for Senator Mullin until a special election can take place. So constant movement there in the Senate. Why do I raise it? Because the specter of reconciliation has reemerged, at least in the House. Speaker Mike Johnson has expressed some willingness to do another reconciliation bill. Again, going back to what we just talked about with the Senate filibuster reconciliation, you can pass budgetary policy with a simple majority. You don't need 60 votes. It's just a question of, is the political will there to do it? And what would even be included in such a reconciliation bill, and how would you pay for such a bill? If you recall, last year on these episodes, we talked about possibly a one bill versus a two bill strategy on how to move forward with what ultimately became the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. They obviously went for one big beautiful bill because they didn't think two was possible. And that's where we find ourselves today. I'm very skeptical that there will be the political will and momentum to do a second reconciliation, but we'll continue to focus on it. Finally, on this big issue of data centers and AI and how to power data centers while maintaining reliability and affordability of the grid. White House had a big event last week where they had a bunch of AI execs sign on to what's called the Ratepayer Protection Pledge, a commitment from these hyperscalers that they will not pass on the costs for powering AI to consumers. And a lot of people kind of, poo-pooed this, said, well, it's non-binding, it's not a big deal, it doesn't have any teeth to it. I actually disagree with that assessment. I do think that there are agencies, like my former agency, FERC, that have tools that could put teeth behind a pledge like this. And should that happen, it'd be very difficult to push back if you don't like the outcome of those teeth when you've just committed publicly in front of the President of the United States and the world on camera to sign this Ratepayer Protection Pledge. So I actually think it was a pretty clever move by the White House to get buy-in on this idea that the costs of winning the AI race aren't going to be borne by American consumers. As I've stated before, all of this to me, ranging from conflict in Iran to meeting the needs of AI and data centers in the U.S., all provide huge opportunities for distributed generation, for demand-side resources. And we will continue to track these developments on future episodes of Policy and Energy Notes with Neil.